A question for you before we meet today's very interesting guest. What is the one building the British didn't burn down when they sacked Washington? You know the White House is white because of the British, right? It used to be the presidential mansion, and it was this horrid, cadaverous gray color. It was kind of a beige cinder block monstrosity. Frankly, I was kind of glad when they burned it down, which the British did during the War of 1812 when they put much of the capital to the torch. When we Americans took back Washington, we painted the presidential mansion white to gloss over its unseemly scorch marks, hence the White House. When I was a staffer in Congress, one of the stories that we liked to tell constituents was that you could still see bullet holes in the Capitol from when the British sacked Washington, which in retrospect I think was probably a lie. Sorry about that, if you were ever on one of my tours. I say it was probably a lie because the British didn't really invade Washington, D.C. They just strolled right in after our government fled. There wasn't an armed resistance. So if they fired shots at the Capitol, they did it for fun, not because politicians from Kentucky were taking pot shots at them from the windows or anything like that. But they did burn down Congress and the Treasury. In the War of 1812, the British systematically burned down all of our young republic's government buildings, save one. They refrained from burning down one government building in the capital. What was it? The U.S. Patent Office. The first superintendent of the Patent Office was a very smart man, Dr. William Thornton, quite the polymath. He studied medicine in Edinburgh, became an American citizen, and with no formal architectural education became the designer of the Capitol building, and he was an inventor, for which he was appointed the first superintendent of the Patent Office by President Jefferson. When the British invaded, and the redcoats strutted around the defeated rebel capital of the so-called United States, lighting fire to any and all significant buildings, this guy, Dr. William Thornton, stayed behind in the city, and he ran out of the patent office and stood directly between it and the British cannons. And this one brave, extremely pissed off bureaucrat proceeded to give the entire British army a tongue lashing. Keep in mind, President Madison, Dolly Madison, Congress, everybody else had hightailed it out of the Capitol. Yet here Thornton is, single-handedly staring down British cannons pointed at his office, glaring at a squadron of torch-bearing dudes in powdered wigs. Dr. Thornton just starts screaming at them, kicks the door open to the patent office and storms out and yells at the British army. Quote, "Are you English or only Goths and Vandals?" And he goes on to say, and I'm lightly paraphrasing here, "Behind me in this building is the repository of American ingenuity, and you would dare put it to the torch? You're at war with the American government. Fine. Are you at war with ideas and knowledge, sirs? Because if you burn this building down, history will rightly remember you as savages who ransacked the intellectual vault of a nation and beggared the unborn masses of her future. So if you want to light up the patent office with cannonballs, they must first pass through me." And the British Army said, "Fine. Jesus, we'll leave the patent office alone. Cripes, calm down, calm down." It's a pretty good story, right? We're at least on the spectrum of bureaucrats, where the bureaucrat is the protagonist. That's about as good as it gets. Some flabby old white guy ripping his shirt open and yelling, "If you want to destroy this office complex, you'll have to kill me first." But, like the aforementioned bullets in the Capitol story, it's not entirely true. Or maybe to put it another way, the story is true, but Thornton's analysis was not. The patent office doesn't exist to promulgate ideas. It exists to protect them from duplication. It's not a library of ideas and knowledge. It is a hall of records for maintaining exclusive temporary monopolies. Remember, this is all at the onset of the Industrial Revolution. Societies saw value in inventions, improvements, and entrepreneurs. And if some particular invention requires a good deal of research to create it, inventors might not bother if they fear somebody will immediately replicate and sell their idea. If it takes me 3 years and 20 shillings to invent a superior mule girdle, or whatever old-timey claptrap people were inventing back then, a coal-powered dandy spoffer. Anyway, the moment I bring my dandy spoffer to market, if a bunch of competitors sell their own models, I might not recoup my research costs. So why would I bother? The patent office then will grant you a temporary exclusive monopoly on an idea to incentivize people to come up with new ideas. Once that monopoly expires, however, the idea is publicly available. The deal the government makes with you is you get temporary exclusivity, but to obtain that protection, you have to reveal how your invention works. You have to give us a schematic on your mule girdle so that when your patent expires, anybody can stroll up to the patent office and see how it's done and start building their own. But there's also an older ideological reason as well. The notion that private property is sacred. The Anglo-Saxon idea of property is rooted in exclusion, that to own something is to say who can't use it. I own my yard because I can tell anyone in the world they are not allowed to come into my yard unless invited. I own my car because only people I authorize to drive my car may do so. No one can use my mule girdle without seeking my permission. Ownership means the ability to exclude. And the patent office, copyright law, and intellectual property is all based on the premise that ideas can be owned, which is probably what actually convinced the British not to burn down the patent office. The side argument that Thornton made when he wasn't ripping his shirt open and daring the limeys to blast him to bit with cannonballs is, look, you want to burn down the White House, fine, we're at war. But these patents aren't the property of the U.S. government. They're the property of individuals. You're not attacking our government, you're attacking private property. Which is an argument that probably resonated with the British. Wait a minute, this is like burning down a bank? Well, I would sooner burn down a church than a bank. Please excuse us, pray tell. Let us adjourn to the nearest reputable bordello. The idea that you can own ideas is interesting. On first blush, I like it. I talk for a living, and I write books. I intuitively understand the desire to protect my work. But it gets squiggly real quick. Let's say I have an interesting hot take on politics, probably about zoning. If some other pundit takes that idea and incorporates it into their own bloviating, I can't say, you didn't lease that idea from me and sue them, which is probably for the best. Benjamin Franklin is kicking around in the era that we're describing. I wouldn't say he gets to own the idea of electricity or the discovery of negative charges. Or if we go back a little bit further, it would be weird if Isaac Newton was able to declare the theory of gravity as his own private property and sue any academic or textbook that incorporated gravity into their own work. And in fact, intellectual property got sticky even in the life of William Thornton, hero of the patent office though he was. Thornton continually complained about his pitiful salary and asked Congress to give him a raise, which it wouldn't. Which might explain why, when a man named John Hall rocked up to his office applying for a patent for a breech-loading rifle, Thornton claimed, I have also invented that breech-loading rifle. When Hall asked, can I see it? Thornton proceeded to hand him a British gun from 1776, which he claimed he made himself. Then, as the superintendent of the patent office, refused to issue Hall a patent for his rifle unless he agreed to include Thornton's name on it as well. Who owns ideas? And how? What shouldn't be owned? And what gets twisted, like Hall's breech rifle, into something parasitic? That is what we're going to talk about today, right here on The Political Orphanage. Hello, and welcome to The Political Orphanage, a home for plucky misfits and problem solvers. I'm your host, Andrew Heaton. And I am so relieved with how today's interview turned out. I was worried about it. Cory Doctorow, who we're going to hear from in a moment, is a well-known activist and tech guy of the super lefty capitalism is evil variety. And I did not think we would get along particularly well. I thought there was a decent chance we just wind up spending an hour screaming at each other about whether Milton Friedman belongs in hell. I think no. And I am happy to report I underestimated Cory, and I underestimated myself. What follows is an excellent chat, primarily about intellectual property, private property of ideas, songs, programming, and also non-compete clauses, which often amount to the same thing, because companies want to stop employees from taking ideas and training and going to other companies. I think where Cory and I converge, and where I am most interested in hearing his perspective, is laws that enable rent-seeking. If you're unfamiliar with the term, rent-seeking is where you just get money because of some loophole or dumb regulation on the books, but you don't actually provide value. It's not that you're getting rich by inventing something or creating something or building something. You're getting rich parasitically. That's rent-seeking, parasitical wealth. So I'm very keen to find laws on the books which enable rent-seeking. As a promoter of free enterprise, I am very much in favor of people getting wealthy. In fact, ridiculously wealthy, for providing value to the world. If Taylor Swift becomes a billionaire because enough people enjoy her music to buy her records and attend her concerts, that's terrific. I have zero problems with Taylor Swift becoming a billionaire. But I am likewise opposed to crony capitalism, wherein somebody becomes a billionaire not by providing value, but because some dumb artifact allows them to hammer a tap into other people's money. Where I think Cory Doctorow and I would diverge is, I think rent-seeking and monopolies are very difficult to create or maintain without the help of government, through patents or regulatory capture or strike-breaking or something. I think Cory would say the shoe is on the other foot, that markets naturally concentrate wealth, corporations naturally collude and conspire, and so rent-seeking is inevitable without government intervention. I think he would say that. Either way, though, I am keen to identify the nuts and bolts of IP law, see what should be scrapped, tweaked, or engorged. And for that, we now turn our attention to my guest, Cory Doctorow. My guest today is Cory Doctorow. He is a journalist, activist, and science fiction author known for his works on digital rights, monopolies, and the future of technology. His most recent book is Picks and Shovels. You can find that book along with all books discussed on this program by going to mightyheaton.com/featured. So I'll begin by both apologizing and inflating your ego. Normally, I try not to ever bring anybody in the program that I don't read at least 50% of their book. I shoot for 70%. I have began your book. I'm maybe 5 chapters in, and I really, really like it. So I haven't read it in its entirety, but I will because it's a really well-written book. You're an excellent novelist.
Well, that's very kind of you. Having written more than 30 books, I like to hope that I've gotten at least competent at it somewhere along the way.
Yeah. Well, you're very okay. This is how engaging you are. If somebody just said, "Do you want to read a book about a hacker in the 1980s?" I would go, "No, that does not sound."
Well, but he's not just a hacker; he's also an accountant.
Yes, exactly. Do you want to hear about the origin story of an accountant who started as a hacker in the 1980s? And I went, all right, you know what? This is the deal. I really want to get on Cory Doctorow, and I'm happy to read the book as part of this process. Within about 5 pages, I was like, God damn, this is a good book. I'm going to read this book.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate that. Forensic accountants are the heroes we need for our times. You know, in the age of the Paradise Papers and the Panama Papers and the IRS leaks, forensic accountants are the ones solving the really interesting crimes.
I agree with you. And I was heartened that maybe 3 chapters in, the plot hinges on non-compete clauses. And I got very excited because I went, oh, thank God. There's something policy in here that I can pick apart, which is my bailiwick for this particular program. I kind of want to weave back and forth between the book and policy. We can kind of do this tennis style where you just keep bringing it back to the book and I bring up policy, or however you want to play it.
Either way. Look, I'm on a book tour, and so I should be talking about the book, but I've worked on tech policy for 25 years, and I spent 3 years locked indoors with 2 people who are sick to the back teeth of hearing me talk about it. So any opportunity to run my mouth about tech policy is one that I usually take.
Great. I'm glad to hear that I could talk tech with you. So, in the book, they moved to California because there is a non-compete clause in California state law. Is this fiction or is this reality? And if so, is it a reality that you like?
Well, it's a non-compete ban in
Okay.
California state
Yes.
law.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm a big fan of people not being bound over to work for dumbbells who start bad companies but had a good idea. And I
Uh-huh.
think there's pretty good empirical evidence here. So actually, what I was trying to do is faint out or kind of elucidate in fiction the good empirics on the difference between Route 128 tech and Silicon Valley tech, because
Hmm.
they both lift off around the same moment. But obviously, Route 128 has really lagged Silicon
Sorry. What
Valley.
is Route 128? I don't know that.
It's the Boston Tech Corridor.
Okay.
It's the
Okay. Thank you.
Massachusetts Tech Corridor.
Right.
And
Yeah.
you know, so you got MIT, you got Stanford, you got Caltech, you've got Harvard, right? So in some ways you could say, okay, well, these guys, they have the same kind of starting point. Obviously, there's a ton of military high-tech contracting going on in both places, but Silicon Valley goes crazy. And right from the start, you can see the role that a weak non-compete regime plays, because the first Silicon Valley company, the company that is the reason we don't call it gallium arsenide Valley,
Uh-huh.
is Shockley Semiconductors, started by Robert Shockley, the guy who won the Nobel Prize or co-won the Nobel Prize for figuring out how to make transistors out of silicon. And Robert Shockley had a really good idea about transistors and very bad ideas about everything else. He was, among other things, an ardent eugenicist who could not be convinced to spend time in the office trying to figure out how to make microchips because he was too busy touring the country, arguing with biologists and offering shares of his Nobel money to black women who would get sterilized.
Wow.
When he did come home to the Bay Area, he was so paranoid and deranged that he was secretly wiretapping his employees, his wife, and his children, and nobody could get a lick of work done. They never shipped a working semiconductor. And so 8 of his original engineers, the traitorous aide, quit his company and started a company called Fairchild, which did ship the first working silicon chip. However, they never achieved liftoff either. It was their breakaway engineers who quit and went and started another company called Intel that
I've
made
heard of that one.
Silicon Valley. And so you could imagine that if this had all happened in Massachusetts, the way this would have gone is you start a company, you reveal yourself to be a lunatic eugenicist, your employees all quit in disgust, and then they spend 3 years, I don't know, like waiting tables because they are not allowed to work on semiconductors anymore, right? And that is, in fact, the story of many Massachusetts Route 128 startups, right? That you have a good idea and a bad person, and that bad person effectively ruins everyone who can see the good idea because they all go to work for them and then figure out that the bad person is not someone who's going to ship a product, but they can't go anywhere else. And so they're just stuck. They have to change fields. And, you know, now here we are 60 years into the experiment, and we can see that the contribution to GDP, the number of patents, anything you want to use to measure like how well Silicon Valley thrived, number of jobs, uh, sheer dollar value of dividends, capital gains, whatever you want to call it, has gone up at a significantly higher rate in the place um, where we don't have non-competes. And what's interesting is that the other big California industry, which is also free from non-competes, is Hollywood. And the traditional argument for non-competes is, how do I stop the IP from walking out the door? Right? I will train people, they will learn my trade secrets, and there will be no way they can start a rival company or go to work for a rival company without stealing from me.
Uh-huh.
And any knowledge intensive industry that doesn't have non competes will therefore die on the vine. And here you have the two most knowledge intensive industries in the world headquartered in the state where there's never been an enforceable non compete. And so, you know, this is one of those things where I know there's lots of people who cherish the freedom to contract and say markets will sort it out and whatever. But, you know, it's great in theory. It just doesn't work in practice. And
Mm.
at a certain point, you have to actually look at what happens and not, you know, assume a frictionless cow of uniform density in a perfect sphere on moving around in your model and
Uh-huh.
actually look at what happens in the world.
you might be able to bring me over on this one. So like you're a socialist or a leftist. I don't know how you identify
I'm
normally.
an agnostic leftist.
Agnostic.
I definitely wouldn't call myself a liberal. I think those guys are sellouts. I'm a
Okay.
leftist. I think
I'm either a sellout liberal or a libertarian or a neoliberal
my
or
my,
something. So we
my friend
worship.
my friend Steve Bruce says that, who is a Trotskyist and a great
Uh-huh.
fantasy writer. He says, to tell if someone's a leftist or something else, you say, what's more important, human rights or property rights? And if they say
Mhm.
property rights are a human right, they're not a leftist. So for me, I think property rights are a means to an end.
Okay.
That if property rights deliver efficient allocations that get everyone water, food, and houses, that's great. But if you're in a city full of empty houses and homeless people, that's not just a market failure. It's proof that the market isn't allocating well, and you should do something else.
I partially agree with you in that
Mhm.
I am a big fan of markets, but because of the end result, rising tide lifting all boats and all of that stuff, I don't know that we would. I don't think we're going to converge on like
Sure.
macroeconomic theory, but I think you might be able to get me on copyright. So like with let's just with IP in general, it's my understanding that this goes way back to like when we opened up the patent office in the United States. Same logic of why would anybody spend time and money developing a product if it could immediately be replicated and sold, and the sales from that will not be enough to make up the R&D that goes into it. Like
Yeah.
it's a reasonable position to take, and I can think of better formats than that. And then the government in turn with a patent, we're not talking about contract, but with a patent, the government in turn gives you a government-backed monopoly on a given
Yeah.
product for a while in theory, so you can recoup your R&D research, right? And I'm like, well, like right now with say pharmaceuticals, what if we didn't have patents? We just had the government like pay you up front. Like if you can develop a generally applicable low cost diabetes medication, we'll buy it from you, and then it'll be open source and anybody can use it. So you'll know how much money that you're getting from the get go. But I can think of other ways of
Yeah.
trying to stimulate innovation other than limited governmental monopolies that are bestowed.
Yeah, so first of all, I'll say that what you described is more or less what we have, except for the open source part. Because when you look at the amount of money pharma companies spend on R&D versus the NIH contributions to R&D and the tax credit contributions to R&D, what you see is that mostly we just publicly pay for that stuff, but then let someone own it, which kind of the worst of all worlds, right? But also, I'd say that that history of where the patent office comes from, it's missing some nuance that I think is useful and may point to an area of even more agreement for the two of us. So there are only two parts of the Constitution that have a rationale. Everything else is held to be self-evident. So there's two places where the framers explain what they want. One is the Second Amendment, right? Famously, a well-regulated militia.
Mhm.
The other one is what's called the Progress Clause, which is to promote the progress of the useful arts and sciences, Congress may establish monopolies of limited times. So this is also the only part of the Constitution that is not prescriptive but suggestive, right? It's the only thing in the Constitution where the framers are like, if you feel like it, and if you think the circumstances warrant it, you can do this, but you don't have to, because they were reacting to the system of patents royal, right? So the systems of patents royal was where the government, the king, would create exclusive realms of industrial activity and copyrights for favored members of society, courtiers and barons and people they wanted to bring into favor with the regime. And they had suffered under it, right? They knew that this was not a good system. And so they were like, there might be times when you could use this, but you don't have to do this all the time. And by the way, here's the only time you should do it is when you can show that it's promoting the useful arts and sciences, not just because you think that someone deserves it for their hard work, for example. So that like one of the keystones of copyright doctrine in the United States is that it is not a sweat of the brow regime. No matter how hard you work, if it isn't creative labor, there's no copyright adhering to it. So a database can't get copyrighted because it's a collection of facts. There's a famous case about phone books where the company that made the phone book said, we worked really hard to make this phone book. And then someone else came along and copied it.
So
And
if
the
I
court
wanted to
said,
make a phone book musical, I would be fine.
ha, yeah. Well, no. The court said you could just copy it verbatim. You can just
Okay.
copy the phone book.
I don't even
You
need to
can
use fair
copy.
use.
If
I
we
can just
had
get
phone
it.
books still, you could go and copy the phone book. We don't have them anymore, but anyone can make a phone book. When I worked in a library, we had a reverse phone book, which is where someone had rekeyed the phone book and then made one that was phone number to name instead of name to phone number. And
Mhm.
that was just a thing you were allowed to do, right? You're still
Mhm.
allowed to do it. We just don't have phone books anymore because the sweat of the brow doesn't attract a copyright. So you could spend 1,000 hours writing a phone book or enumerating all the colors in alphabetical order or doing anything else that doesn't require creativity, and you would have no copyright under existing US law. You could spend 10 seconds dashing off a haiku, and it would be your copyrighted work until you'd been dead for 70 years. Because it's not how much work you do, it's whether the useful arts and sciences are being promoted to as per the progress clause.
Mhm. So, okay, with non-competes, for example, I
Mhm.
see two kind of dueling ways to approach this. One is the sanctity of agreements between two free parties, and the other one is a more consequentialist bent. I think you've got a very, very good consequentialist argument, which is the state that has non-compete clauses does really, really well in terms of innovation and IP. I take it that that's like the origin story, more or less, for why California's become so dominant in tech versus some of the other places. So the consequentialist argument, I think, is really, really strong. Do you think there's anything to the look? This is a contractual agreement. Two parties signed on to it, and free parties should be allowed to engage in agreements, or it's overweighed by the consequence. How do you navigate this?
So I'm not just a consequentialist here. I actually think that the failure of neoclassical economics is because it's hard to do math on power. We assume it doesn't matter. So 1 in 18 American workers is bound by non-compete, and the median non-compete worker is a minimum wage fast food worker, right? And so the median worker under non-compete is being prevented from making a nickel an hour more by switching from the cash register at Wendy's to the fry line at McDonald's. And you can say, well, these are
May I
freely,
pause you? I want to make sure I
yeah,
understand this. If I go work at McDonald's, I have to sign a non-compete for some amount of time to go work at Wendy's.
three
Is this right?
years. Yeah,
Really? I had no
yeah.
idea. I just kind of
You
assumed
can't
this
work in
was
food
was
service.
content and donor
Yeah.
bases and things like that. But this is not just knowledge workers. This is fast food workers that have non-competes.
Well, yeah, and knowledge workers, at least at the upper echelons, have bargaining power. And where they have bargaining power, they typically say no because, it's very bad. And where they do
Mhm.
get non-competes, it's things like you will agree not to work in the industry for 3 years if we choose to pay you your full salary for 3 years after you quit. Right?
Mhm.
That's an equitable non-compete, right? The
That's like
non-equitable
when a
non-compete.
Fox host gets canned or something, and like with
Yeah,
Tucker Carlson, theoretically, according to his agreement, they were going to pay him out, and he couldn't do media on another network or something like that, where there's at
right.
least a remunerative
Yeah.
agreement
My
there. Yeah.
When my wife worked at the BBC, my wife's British. When she worked at the BBC, people who were laid off were given what was called gardening leave. So you get 6 months paid leave to sit in the garden
Yeah.
afterwards, but you couldn't go work for Channel 4 or Sky or whatever while you were on
Do
gardening
with
leave.
with people that are at Wendy's and McDonald's, I can't fathom. I don't like that, but I can't fathom that anybody actually takes them to court. Like, does
Oh, no,
McDonald's
no,
have
no. It happens all the time. They
really?
sue
So
franchisees. They sue franchisees for inducing people to violate their non-competes. And so franchisees just don't try and hire people who have worked for another franchisee. So it's
okay.
just a way to suppress wages, right?
So I'm McDonald's, and I know that Wendy's across the street is trying to get my employees to come over. I
Yeah.
rather than going after the employees directly, I go after the franchise to make them stop it and go,
Yeah.
you're violating your employees are violating our non-compete with them, and we're going to sue them through you or something
Yeah.
like
You're a
that. Quit
tortious
doing it.
interferer.
Mhm.
Yeah, you're
Okay.
inducing contractual violation. And the other place where we see it a lot is where there are private equity roll-ups of a sector, so like funeral homes, pet grooming, and it's the low-wage frontline workers. So, especially in pet grooming, it's become very common, and it's often paired with something that is sarcastically called training related something something. It stands for trap, where they say, okay, well, your first 3 weeks on the job are training. You don't get paid for them. And if you quit in under 3 years, you owe us $5,000 for the training we gave you. And when you look at the people who take those jobs and they describe their training period, they're just sweeping the floor for 3 weeks.
Hmm.
They haven't received any special knowledge, but it's just a way to stop people from moving from market from it's a way to stop markets from reallocating resources. I mean, if you want to think
Mhm.
about it in terms of market logic, right? It's a way to create like dead weight loss in markets
Right.
so talent doesn't migrate to opportunities.
Okay. All right. And then the idea would be if we were to outlaw or severely restrict non-compete agreements, that the competition which would ensue that would stop you from selling out. I don't know, like I've got a donor database because I'm the development guy at a company. The thing that would stop me from immediately jumping somewhere else would be like carrot instead of stick, where maybe
Trade
like
secrecy as well, though. I mean, there's trade secrets. We have a federal trade secret law. I'm
okay,
not a huge fan of it. I think it's a little overbroad. But the argument is that it's just impossible to enforce a trade secret. You'll never know. You'll never know if the stockbroker brings his book of business to a rival brokerage and then
right.
a client jumps, whether that happens because they looked through the book of business and they made cold calls, or whether that's because the client called the old office and they said, well,
I was when I worked in prime time, I was very careful to keep a duplicate entry of contacts in case I got fired.
yeah,
I called it
sure.
my lifeboat file, and
Yeah,
I'm sure I signed a non compete and an NDA and all sorts of stuff. I don't remember what it was, but had they brought that to the fore, I would have gone. Look, I go to a bunch of parties in New York. I know a lot of people.
sure. What the DEA calls parallel construction,
Right?
right? We
Okay.
didn't get this through an illegal warrant, an illegal search. We also had a warrant.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Well, and then there'd be positive things like vestiture, right? So like, you're gonna stay here. You could leave at any second. There's not a non-compete. You could leave tomorrow if you felt like it, but we're gonna give you more incentives to stay longer. We'll
Sure.
pay you more if you're here, something
Yeah.
like that. So there would be a different model other than the non-compete clause that would still allow these things to happen.
Yeah. So, the one of the few antitrust cases that succeeded before the antitrust revolution that happened when Biden got elected was a no poach agreement between the tech firms and a few of the entertainment companies, Disney and Pixar, where they agreed that they would just not try and hire each other's top staff. And it's an illegal collusive arrangement to fix the price of labor. And the alternative to having having illegal no poach agreements is to be a better place to work.
Hmm.
I'm not like the world's most Hayek pilled market fan, but I think that is good, right?
Uh-huh.
Like I think it's good if someone retains a customer or an employee by being better.
Yeah. Okay. So far, Corey, I'm with you. This sounds like I'm still yay market. I'm still very pro market. I'm not in the
Sure.
socialist camp. However, it does sound to me like this would be a more efficient allocation of resources based on what you're saying. And let alone, I will acknowledge there is a certain level of what do you call it? Asymmetric clout that can exist in these
Yeah.
things. Like
Power.
a few years ago, yes, power. A few years ago, New York passed a law that you can't ask a prospective employee in a job interview what their previous salary was. And I was like, I'm fine with that. That doesn't seem to me to be like overly onerous, and that there's a level of kind of aggregated like backstop that people have as a result of that does not offend my Hayekian market sensibilities so much.
Sure.
All right.
Sure.
Well, okay. Then kind of jumping to a broader category like copyright law.
Yeah.
If you were put in charge of copyright law, we're going to reboot copyright law, redo it from scratch. What does it look like now? What would you change?
So copyright today is not just a single regime about copying, display, and adaptation, but also a set of related rights. So things like the anti-circumvention right, and I would probably get rid of all of those. So anti-circumvention came into law in 1998 when Bill Clinton signed the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. Section 1201 of the DMCA makes it a felony with a 5-year prison sentence and a $500,000 fine to bypass an access control that controls access to a copyrighted work. And so what that was supposed to do was stop you from modding your DVD player so that you could play out of region DVDs, which I still think is bullshit. Like you buy a DVD somewhere, you bring it home, you watch it. Like if the company would prefer that you not do that, okay, fine. But the point of
Yeah.
property rights is not that you have an obligation to arrange your use of property that's transferred to you by a vendor in ways that makes that vendor most happy. Their remedy, if they don't like how you use the thing they sell you, is not to sell it to you, not to invoke the power of the state to control you. But this quickly metastasized beyond these penny ante grifts, like making sure you only bought Sega Dreamcast games that came from a Sega Dreamcast pressing plant where they charged game makers to press every CD. They charged them a royalty, and became what we see today, which is like if you're a farmer and you fix your tractor, because farmers fix their own tractors, you still have to have John Deere come out and charge you $200 to type an unlock code into the keyboard
This is
in
like
the
right of
tractor.
repair territory. Yeah.
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 Yeah, and so this is just because it's a felony to make a tool that bypasses that initialization step. And under normal market circumstances, you just have people making and selling that tool. I mean, farmers have been fixing their own agricultural equipment since farming started. There's a great open air museum in the UK, like what we would call a pioneer village here, but they didn't have pioneers then. They had like Victorians and Edwardians and stuff,
Hmm.
called Beamish. And at Beamish, they've got a farmhouse with a Roman foundation, and there's a forge, because literally for thousands of years farmers have been fixing their own tools, right?
Mm.
When the storm is coming and the harvest has to come in, you don't wait for the technician. So that's one of the problems here. Another problem of this is that, like, during the lockdowns, hospitals could not swap working screens out of dead ventilators into working ventilators with dead screens, because you had to initialize the part, and there were no technicians from Medtronic, who are the monopolists who make all the med tech, who could come to your hospital
Meaning
and
that
fix it.
if I wanted to swap that screen out, I couldn't do it unless somebody from the company had like an access code and they came in and
Yeah,
went,
they
"Yep,
have to
we
come
got
out
you."
and plug a USB stick
Okay.
into your ventilator to initialize the part, because it knows that it was previously donated from another device. So it's just a way for them to maintain a racket, right? But this gets worse. So, like, in Poland, there's a train company called Nuvog, and they just got caught uh, writing logic bombs for their locomotives, where if the locomotive is parked in a known rival service depot, the train bricks itself, and they charge 20,000 euros to remotely reboot it. And one of the ways this came to light is they drew the geofence rectangle too wide, so it overlapped a piece of mainline track, and whenever a train went through the mainline track, it would stop moving. Because they just were, like, not just crooked, but sloppy.
Uh-huh.
But, I think most people experience this, like, on the reg with things like, if you're a software author and you make an app, and I'm a person who owns a phone, I'm not allowed to install a third-party app store, so I can only get your app from the official app store, and the official app store takes a 30% skim off of that purchase price for the payment, for the transaction and all subsequent transactions. So you're not allowed to use a third-party payment store for anything. So, like, if you're a newspaper and you get a monthly subscription through your app, every subscription dollar comes back 30 cents lighter after making a
Right.
round trip through Cupertino. And that, like, the market rate for payment processing is like 3% in the US, which is considered monopolistic and price gouging. And there's a case against Visa over this. And in Europe, it's 1%. And for Apple, it's 30%. It's their most profitable line of business. But, I think the apotheosis of this is printer ink, where it's just against the law to defeat the thing that checks your printer where your printer checks to see whether you're using OEM ink or a refill cartridge or a third-party cartridge. And just disabling that is against the law, which means that HP, which has bought most of its rivals and is part of a cartel of 4 companies, along with those, the rest of the cartel, have monotonically raised the price of ink. Ink is now the most expensive fluid you can buy as a civilian without a permit. It's more than $10,000 a gallon. The colored
Really?
water you print, the colored water you print your grocery list with costs more than the semen of a Kentucky Derby winning stallion, right?
And I make nothing on horse semen right now. I'm barely breaking even, Corey. I need to get into ink.
But I'm hardly the world's greatest fan of markets, as I've noted. But this is the kind of thing I think markets just, like, solve 6 times before breakfast, right?
Mhm.
It's just that we have this regulatory intervention that's just stuck in the middle of
Right.
a market transaction that usurps both, like, labor relations. So me as a creative worker, if I want to
Uh-huh.
sell you something on the App Store, I got to give 30 cents to Apple. And also distorts, competition more broadly, where, like, SMEs and new market entrants don't erode the rents that are extracted by dominant firms.
Right. Well, I see 2 different phenomenon there that are very similar. One is contract agreements, one is regulatory regime, right? So,
Mhm.
like, a law that stops me from interoperability of printing ink is not a contractual obligation. That is, the regime has been co-opted by monopolies or companies in order to get rent seeking from it. Very, very bad. I don't like that at all. And I agree with you. If I've bought the printer and I've bought the ink, like, we're done. We don't need any further intervention here. Like, it's mine now. I own it. I can do whatever I want with it. That's America. Yay, America. You could make at least a judicial argument that with certain products that I'm in effect leasing it from somebody under their terms and conditions. So I can see at least a legal framework for that kind of thing to exist. But I'm with you on in terms of
Yeah.
a lot of copyright laws and a lot of regulatory regimes basically ending up in rent seeking. And like as a Hayekian market guy, I don't like rent seeking. I want to get rid of rent seeking so that we can have more innovation and affluence and whatnot. Me not being in the tech space, I am new to a lot of the terms in this, but it sounds like the thing that you're primarily concerned with is interoperability.
That's one of them. I mean, we could talk about like making terms shorter too. Like the argument, if you look at the Constitution, it says to promote the useful arts and sciences, you can create these monopolies of limited times. So the argument that there's like a new work at the margin that is created when you say to an author, you get life plus 70 years versus life plus 50, I think it's very hard to make that argument. There is no economic model where the time value of money at 70 years amounts to a hill of beans.
Isn't pretty much like all copyright law just basically Disney pushing to keep Mickey Mouse? Like I realize that like
part of it.
the old like the very first Steamboat Mickey one is now public use, but every time anything from Disney comes up, they push really hard for it. I'm with you on that, by the way. Like I make funny videos for a reason, and one of the things that I get really irritated by is we are dutiful and we're dutiful and exact about fair use clause and fair use law. And it really ties my hands behind my back as a creator in a way that's really irritating. I'm not trying to rip anybody off. I'm not trying to take anybody else's content and re-microwave it and present it as mine. I'm wanting to make a funny video, but I'm really, really strict. Even with kind of broad parody use, I'm limited in terms of what I can do. And having a copyright on a book for 20 years as opposed to life of the author plus 70. There's some point at which we can acknowledge that it's gone too long.
Here's a copyright proposal that you would probably like as a kind of good, kind of market-oriented one. So Lawrence Lessig, the law professor, he had an idea. In 1978, the Copyright Act abolished what was called formalities, which is where you had to register to get a copyright. And that's when copyright just exploded, because now anything fixed in a tangible medium is copyrighted for the life of the author in 70 years, which just means everything is a minefield. And what he said is, why don't we give a certain number of years of copyright at the moment of fixation? Call it 20 years. You just mentioned 20. That's fine. And then if you register it for $1, you get the full term of copyright. But you have to keep your address up to date so people know who to ask if they want to license it. And so we restore formalities for a long-lived copyright. We have a version of that already where statutory damages are only available if you register your copyright. Otherwise, you're limited to actual damages. But we could go further. It's hard within the existing international copyright framework. The WTO agreement on copyright, the TRIPS, is more extensive than that. But I mean, the U.S. ignores its trade obligations all the time.
Would that change anything, though? I think I follow the logic. Like under English law and Scots law for property, like English law, it's all in a book and it's there forever. So if 200 years from now you figure out that your farm actually is 40 feet further west than you thought, you can go to the local office and you can get that restored. Under Scots law, if you forget about it after
there's an easement.
After 10 or 15 years, like it's done. You didn't contest it, it's gone. You don't have rights to it anymore, right? So I kind of see the logic there of if you're forgetting about the copyright because you don't care about it, you're just squatting on it, letting it go. But all the stuff that I'm likely to hit up is going to be bigger stuff. So like Stephen King, the music at the Kinks, like I would assume that the publishing house and the recording label are going to have a guy that dutifully makes sure. So I don't know that it would change anything.
Well, it won't solve your problem necessarily, but the vast majority of copyright liability and concern relates to ephemeral things that have no visible owner. And from a kind of cultural standpoint, the greatest impediment to preservation, right, to archiving, preservation, and reproduction, is the majority of works are orphaned after a very short period, long before their copyrights terminate. And so there's this incredible statutory risk, right? Like $150,000 per infringement statutory damages if you choose to preserve something, even if you can't locate the proprietor of that copyright. And so, they're like, now you mentioned that Steamboat Willie's gone into the public domain. We had a 20-year pause on the public domain. The 1998 Copyright Act stopped anything from entering the public domain for 20 years. So in 2019, we got the first re-entry into the public domain of new works. And what we're seeing now is a lot of silent film, but a huge proportion of silent film, I believe it's 80% of silent films are gone, right? So they're just completely gone. We have records of their existence, but we do not have the films.
Hmm.
And that was because preservation of this media was impossible. Even if you think about, like, I look at children's drawings from other periods as a very interesting source of understanding the commonalities and differences between societies. So if your kindergartner draws a picture today and they're 5 and they live to 80, that means that in 2100 they will be dead. And in the year 2170, that drawing enters the public domain. Right? I think we could say, okay, well, maybe you don't want kindergartner stuff just being commercially exploited. If it turns out that you have a prodigy, a new Mozart or whatever, we don't want to take it. But 20 years seems very reasonable to me for like a default period of copyright. And then if the kid wants to maintain their copyright beyond that, let them register the copyright in that work.
Conceded. I like this. You've convinced me of this, Cory. Okay, great. And I'll add, like, I don't know a whole lot about, like, patent law again, but it seems to me that patent trolls are a really big problem where
sure are.
The system was intended to let you recoup your R&D and incentivize you to do a thing where if you didn't have the financial windfall of a temporary government monopoly, you wouldn't do it. But if you then get a bunch of people that go, oh, I'm just going to write as many ideas down as I can that I don't have any intention of selling or executing, it's just so I can sue people if they ever come up with the same idea, then the system's no longer working on what it did. And I could see copyright law for creative purposes doing the same thing.
And it's the Fifth Circuit, right? So this is like the world's most property-friendly circuit, the circuit where all the cases about freedom to contract and whatever are gerrymandered into. That's the circuit that says if you've got a patent, we'll let you enforce it, even if all you manufacture is lawsuits. And so there's one town in Texas where every single patent troll claims to have its offices.
Where every patent troll lives. There's like 40,000 people that all have an office in this one warehouse.
It's just mailboxes, right? Hilariously, Samsung bought this town a year-round outdoor skating rink in order to influence juries. So this town in Texas where it's like 120 degrees in the summer has an outdoor skating rink that is kept iced in the summer
year round. That is like Turkmenistan dictator shit right there. That is ostentatious waste of resources.
With the emphasis on Austin.
So I've read some of your work, and I think it's fair to say that you view Spotify and other platforms as being predatory towards creators. I recently read an article by Arnold Kling out of Mercatus, and he made the argument that it's not that Spotify is being predatory, it's that Spotify, Amazon Publishing, et cetera, have made it easier than ever to enter the market as a creator. There's no middlemen anymore. And so the supply has become gigantic, which means the demand has dropped. And so what we're seeing is not that these companies are taking advantage. It's that, like, I've self-published books. I can do that now. Therefore, there are more books. Therefore, the books are worth less. How would you navigate that position?
Well, that has a superficial plausibility, but when you attend to the details of Spotify particularly, and Spotify and Kindle Unlimited are very different worlds. When you look at how Spotify came into existence and the way it accounts, you see a different fact pattern. So Spotify emerged at a moment in which 3 companies, Warner, Universal, and Sony, had captured 70% of all sound recording copyrights and 65% of all composition copyrights. And in the wake of the Napster lawsuits, it became very clear that shoot first, ask questions later was not going to fly for a music distribution company. So when Spotify approached the big 3 labels for access to their catalog, as a condition of giving that access, the big 3 labels required that Spotify allow them to help design the royalty system and give them substantial equity stakes. And so now you have the 3 labels who are in a position of irreconcilable conflict of interest because they're both shareholders and suppliers. And the more they get as suppliers, right, the higher the per song rate, the less money they can take out in dividends and capital gains. And the revenue that they extract in royalties, their musicians have a contractual claim on. But the revenues they extract as dividends or capital gains, musicians have no claim on. And so they structured a system that minimized royalties in favor of dividends. And there are lots of ways in which this is quite dirty. So one is...
Wait, can I pause you just because there's a lot coming at me? I want to make sure I understand this.
Yeah.
So Model A would be we are going to be a platform for your songs, like I'm Apple Music and you're paying 99 cents per song and we take 30 cents per song or whatever. But what they're doing is selling a subscription model so that they're not doing this platform model. Rather, we're getting our money from the subscription, and therefore we are incentivized now to do that rather than give you royalties, because we're not getting money per song. We're getting money for the subscription. Am I following that right?
Sort of. I mean, look, they could. So there are licensing revenues built into the standard music deal. So the standard music deal, it's about, I believe it's like a 12% royalty on sales and a 50% royalty on licensing, which is to say that if you are licensing music, you owe the musicians more than if you're selling it. One of the interesting things about iTunes is that they told you, the customer, that it was a license, which is why you couldn't play it on a third-party device or sell it or give it away. All those things that you can do when you buy something, but you can't when you enter into, we mentioned before, if you have a lease or a license, whatever, right? So they said to you, you're not making a purchase of a song, you're making a purchase of a license to a song. But when they accounted for it to the musicians, they said, no, it was a sale, because otherwise we'd owe you 50% of the royalties. So in fact, we only owe you 12% of the royalties. So that's how iTunes worked. But there's no reason to say that they couldn't come up with some licensing scheme. They could say the per song licensing royalty is, let's say, 1 cent, and then they'd owe half a cent to the musicians. But instead, they said, we're going to make the licensing rate 1/100th of 1 cent. And that means that on a cash basis, the business is more profitable, right? Because they are paying less for their supplies, right? The key factor of production, which is songs, right? And this is where the label takes off their licensor hat, where they're extracting money from Spotify as a supplier, and they put on their co-owner hat. And they say, well, the more retained earnings we have, the higher our capital gains will be and the more dividends or stock buybacks we can do. And that's very good for us. So the cheaper the music is, the more money we take out. And the money we take out of the business, in not as a licensor, but as an owner, belongs to our shareholders alone. We have no contractual obligation to share that money with our workforce, with our suppliers. They can, eat shit. So they structure this deal, and then it gets better. So one of the things they do is they insist on a most favored nation contractual clause. So the 30% of music that isn't controlled by Sony, Warner, Universal has to also sell at whatever, 1/100th of a cent per stream, but they don't get an equity stake. Then the labels arrange for minimum monthly payments from Spotify. So they say, okay, the rate per track is, again, I'm using 1/100th of a cent as a placeholder. I can't remember how many hundredths of a cent is, but it's sort of directionally correct. It's, between 1,000th and 1/100th of a cent per track. They say, we will, irrespective of how many tracks from the Sony catalog you play, we'll get, say, $30 million a month. Okay, well, so now they're getting $30 million a month, but because the per track rate is like homeopathic, right? Just this infinitesimal fraction of a penny. When you add up any reasonable number of tracks that all of the world could listen to on Spotify, it's not going to add up to $30 million. So Spotify is handing Sony $30 million. But when Sony adds up how much they owe their musicians, because they've insisted on this low per track rate, it only comes to $20 million. So now they have $10 million in what are called unattributable royalties. And those unattributable royalties can be used in any way they see fit. So they can use it for development, which might just mean paying executives a bonus to fly around the country and listen to bar bands, or, paying their idiot nephew to fly around the country and listen to bar bands. They can use it for kind of a gambit where you pick out an artist and make them king for the day, where you give them a ton of money, you attribute the royalties to them, and then you turn around and you say, look at how fair we are to our musicians. Here's this person who's done really well. I call this the giant teddy bear gambit, because if you go to a carny, like by 10 a.m., someone's won the giant teddy bear at the peach ball, but
Right.
you don't actually get 5 balls in the peach basket. Like the carny says, like, I tell you what, if you can get just like 1 ball,
I like
and I'll
the
give
cut
you
of your
a
jib,
keychain.
young man. Here you go.
Yeah, that's
Please
right.
walk around the rest of the day with a giant teddy bear to let everybody know it's
Be
possible.
my Judas goat, right?
Yeah.
So they pick a Judas goat. This is Joe Rogan getting $100 million from Spotify too. He's just got a giant teddy bear. So you get these people who are wandering around with getting these big chunks of money, And then the labels also insist on free promotional access. So, like, if there's a playlist that's really popular, like chill music or hip hop caviar or whatever, rap caviar, for free, their tracks are included in there. Whereas the 20% of music or 30% of music that they don't control has to pay for placement. And again, that's stuff that they don't have to account for to their artists. So they can take the stuff where they have the lowest royalty rate, right? Where they've negotiated the shittiest rate with the artist, and they can preferentially put that in the most played playlists. And then they get free advertising. So you have a cartel, which, because of its existence, right? Because the cartel exists and they control a key factor of production, everyone who enters the market to do a related industry has to do so on terms set by them, who cement their dominance and at the expense of smaller competitors and their workforce perpetually. So the idea that this is just an expansion in the supply doesn't line up with the actual cash book accounting and prospectus that Spotify admits to, right? So it just doesn't hold water. I mean, we can talk about Kindle Unlimited. It's a different matter, but
Well, and again, I want
but
to make sure that I'm understanding this. Just the thrust of your counter argument to Kling is, if we calculate all of the supply and we calculate all of the demand, it doesn't account for the gap that you're describing. Therefore, the gap is not a product of increased supply. It has to be something else, and that is cartel behavior, intentionally extracting more wealth than merely that.
Well, what I would say is that inductive reasoning only gets you so far, right? Eventually, you should look at what the contracts between the companies say that are setting these rates. And what you find is that the rate setting is not the result of an oversupply. The rate setting is the result of a cartel of three companies that anti-competitively acquired all of their rivals, cornered the market on sound recordings, and then structured all subsequent market entrants to their benefit.
Is that something that could be modified through copyright law, or do I have to go full socialist with you on this one and have the People's Commissar on music, or can I just modify copyright law?
So if you listen to the radio, no one who's dropping the needle on a record in the DJ booth is negotiating a rate. Instead, what's happening is they are bargaining with a collecting society that was created by a consent decree in the 1930s when radio came along. It's a history of technology and copyright's really interesting because it's a history of people changing positions based on whether they are disruptors or disruptees. So, the first sound recordings are just like absolutely loathed by the songwriters. John Philip Sousa said, if the infernal talking machines are allowed to continue, we'll lose our voice boxes as we lost our tails when we came down out of the trees, right? And what happened was Congress just created a blanket rate for music. So they took away the freedom to contract. What they said was, if someone pays a penny per record, they can record any song that's ever been recorded and released. And they just have to pay the composer a penny for every one that they release. So when Sid Vicious records My Way, he doesn't ask Paul Anka's permission. He just records My Way. That's where covers come from, right? It's we think of it as like if you said that was going to be the regime for, I don't know, pharmaceuticals or whatever, people would get very
I thought
shirty.
Covers were like fair use because I'm making a new product and
no, they're licensed.
Really?
No, they're licensed. They're licensed from
covers. Congress set a rate of recompense of one penny per song or whatever.
It's not just that, right? Because then people start playing records on the radio, and the people who said when we did it that was progress turned around and said to the broadcasters, when you do that, that's piracy. And ASCAP, which was the collecting society, refused to license music for radio play. But ASCAP was also like a creature of the kind of white supremacist and classist ethos of the day, and they wouldn't represent what were called hillbilly artists, which are country artists, or race artists, which was black artists. And so those two groups of artists founded a new collecting society called BMI, and BMI broke the boycott, and they licensed to radio, and then ASCAP came in. And then Congress got involved because they said, okay, well, now you have two organizations fixing prices. You need a consent decree. So they created a consent decree that allowed any music to be played on the air. And so that's every needle drop you've ever heard on every radio station is governed by that. But then along comes cable. And cable starts in Pennsylvania, in a town in central Pennsylvania that was too far from Pittsburgh or Philly to get broadcast stations. And the TV salesmen are like, this is a serious impediment to business. So they put up a giant antenna, a community access TV antenna, and they run wires to their customers' houses, and they retransmit broadcast signals for free into their customers' houses. And the broadcasters, who a generation before had been saying, when we do it, it's progress, turned around and said to the cable operators, when you do it, it's piracy. And Congress stepped in again and set another compulsory license on broadcast signals, where you can retransmit any broadcast signal from the air on any cable, provided you pay a fixed rate. And so this is, when you look at your cable bill, you will see there is a broadcast rights fee. And that is there because they're retransmitting terrestrial television. And then the VCR gets invented in 1976. And the cable operators, who had said to the broadcasters, who had said to the phonogram producers, who had said to the composers, when we do it, it's progress, turned around and said to Sony, who made the first VCR, when you do it, it's piracy. 8 years later, the Supreme Court legalized the VCR in a case called Universal, or the Betamax case in 1984. And then along comes Napster, right? And Sony, who made the VCR, that disrupted cable, that disrupted broadcast, that disrupted phonograms, that disrupted printed sheet music, turns around and says to Napster, when we did it, it was progress. When you do it to us, it's piracy. And that's the first time history stops. And the Supreme Court says in Grokster, the key dicta of Universal, of Betamax, which is that any device capable of sustaining a non-infringing use is legal, right? So if you can use it legally, it's legal to own the device. They turn around, they say, not anymore. Not anymore. Not with Napster. Because Napster, there was, and not just Napster, but Grokster and all these other P2P tools had more public domain and freely shareable works than are contained in like 10 libraries of Congress. It was just still only 1% of what they had. The rest was all pirate material. And rather than creating a blanket license, which is what Napster had asked for, they just said, like, tell us how many zeros you want at the end of the check to make Napster legit. They just said it's banned. You have to get permission. You must license, right? This is freedom of contract trumps state intervention in markets. Go and find the owners and pay them license fees. And that's what Spotify did. Spotify went and found the owners, 3 companies that controlled 70% of the phonograms and 65% of the compositions, and they met the terms on which it was sold. And they created this system called Spotify that pays very small amounts of money to creative workers, and that blocks new market entrants.
So then, if we were to resume this cycle, you would modify the IP law and then have Congress come in and say you have to pay a blanket fee as opposed to do contract. That would be the way to get this back in sync with the cycle.
Well, either that or so there are 3 different approaches that we've seen in the history of copyright. So one is the consent decree. So Congress doesn't set the rate. You get BMI and ASCAP setting the rate, but Congress blesses it.
Okay.
Right. The other one is the compulsory mechanical, where Congress sets the rate. And the third one is the VCR regime, where they say, go pound sand. You just don't get anything for this use. Right. All of those are plausible. All of them have delivered. Right. So if you want to just sort of say, did it work? They all worked. Right. I think that having collecting societies that had some statutory basis and limits. So one of the problems we see, there are collecting societies in lots of countries that collect on behalf of artists for live performance, for radio, and so on. And they're pretty corrupt. Intermediaries, they have, especially when they're really powerful and when they have a monopoly. There's so much temptation for the intermediary to usurp the relationship between business customers and end users. This is Uber doubling the price of a taxi and cutting the rates they pay the drivers in half. It's the mafia controlling jukeboxes. You just see it everywhere. You see powerful intermediaries. So one of the things that collecting societies do is they mark as much revenue as they can as an unattributable royalty. They just don't look very hard for who they owe the money to. And then they spend it for internal purposes. And so you see their executives making big paychecks and so on. So one statutory requirement we could put on a collecting society is we could say the only thing you're allowed to do with an unattributable royalty is improve your attribution systems. So you could, you're always going to have unattributable royalties in a big complicated system, but the only thing you can use is quality, is catalog quality improvement. The other thing is that every collecting society in the world has its own unique rights catalog.
Can you give me some examples of collecting societies? Because this term is new
Yeah.
to me as well. Is collecting
Yeah, if you want to play
is Spotify a collecting society? Is
No.
this like AFTRA? Like what is a collecting
Yeah,
society?
not after it. No, it's like if you want to play music in a barber shop, you pay a collecting society, or kindergarten, or a restaurant, you pay a collecting society. That's already the case, right? It's the case here. It's the case. Yeah, Harry Fox is the big agency most people license from, but there are other agencies. So this is one of the reasons stores play Muzak, is
Mhm.
because they can license a smaller catalog. But if you just want a universal license to all the music, you just buy a license, and the collecting society collects. And artists generally can't opt out of a collecting society. So if it's recorded, you have to do it. And ASCAP BMI are like that. So a DJ doesn't have to make sure before they drop the needle that the artist whose record they're about to play is a member of the societies they paid, right? Every artist is opted in to it once you've released the sound recording. Uh, one funny exception is there's a radio station in the Florida Keys called Parrot Head Radio that plays nothing but Jimmy Buffett songs,
Uh-huh.
and they have a license with Jimmy Buffett.
Okay.
And it's less than you would pay to license the whole catalog of all the music ever recorded. But every collecting society in the world, whether they're collecting for sync rights, which is like putting music in a commercial, or collecting for live performance, or collecting for covers. So, there's a collecting society that collects for covers, right? When Paul Anka has his music covered by Sid Vicious also doesn't have to find Paul Anka to pay him the penny. He pays a collecting society, and the collecting society remits.
From like an economic standpoint, this is a way of streamlining things so that
It's a clearinghouse.
if I'm a DJ, I don't have to preemptively find every single musician that
Yeah.
I've got. And this is not a thing where every musician's opted into it and it's just convenient, but there's actually been some sort of congressional mandate that goes, look, everybody's using this thing from now on. You don't get to opt out. If they pay this
Yeah.
collecting house, they're covered. You can't sue
Yeah.
them for using your music.
So it's both, right? On the one hand, there's a statutory basis that opts everyone in. And on the other hand, there's a consent decree that exempts it from antitrust enforcement. So you get both regulatory forbearance and regulatory intervention.
Okay.
Because otherwise, a collecting society would be a cartel fixing a price, right?
Is this why you'll have political candidates that'll play some song at at one of their campaign rallies, and then the artist will go, "We don't want our music played
Yeah,
at that
but if
campaign."
the venue is licensed it, then it's fine. Yeah.
Got it. So it's not that they reach out to the record company and go, "We really like the Village
it's
People."
just the venue. Yeah.
Okay.
I
All
mean,
right.
I like this is a case. That's a case where I think like norms are pretty good. Like if every time your candidate plays your favorite band's music, the guy goes on the air and says, "I think that candidate's an asshole and no one should vote for him." You would think, and then the news covers that and goes like,
Yeah.
"Look at this guy playing music by someone who hates his guts." You'd think that like eventually the candidate would go,
Paul Simon keeps coming on to say how horrible I am. Maybe I won't provoke Paul
Right.
Simon because the political backlash
maybe I'll
will be
stop
worth.
doing that. Yeah.
Yeah.
So every collecting society in the world has its own unique database, right? That's not the database that every other collecting society uses. It's really expensive, and they all have different holes in them. So one other thing we could do statutorily through something like the World Intellectual Property Organization, which is the UN specialized agency that makes copyright treaties, is create a global rights database that was open and transparent. And so like that would really improve collecting societies. When you actually look at the problems of collecting societies, there are about a half dozen really significant problems with them, and they're all not difficult to imagine how to address. I actually wrote a book about this. So Rebecca Giblin, who's a copyright expert from the University of Melbourne, and I wrote a book called Choke Point Capitalism. And the first half dozen chapters are explaining how entertainment and tech monopolies have rigged the game against creative workers and their audiences. And the second half are shovel-ready policy prescriptions. So like, for example, we interviewed a source who works for a firm that has audited done about 10,000 record label royalty audits. And in all of those audits, there's only one instance in which they found an error made in favor of the artist. They were all every error they found was in favor of the label.
I'm not a statistician, but that sounds like a probability issue that you could.
Well, I think that
rule on.
I think that it's probably very vexing to be an accountant working in one of those localized probability storms that causes that kind of math to occur in your ledgers over and over again. But here's the thing, right? When an artist discovers a problem with their royalties, What the label says is like, you creative people are adorable, but your math sucks. We don't really owe you any money, but you don't want to sue us. You don't have the money. We have all the lawyers. Tell you what, we will give you half of what you think we owe you, but you have to sign a non-disclosure, and your lawyer or your accountant rather has to agree never to audit us again. So it's like the forensics team turns up and you say, all right, lads, look for my wife's body wherever you want, just not that corner of the garden. I'm very sentimental about it, right? And contract is matter state law. If you amended state law in 3 states where all the entertainment contracts are settled, which is Tennessee because of Nashville, and then California and New York, with a little bit of Seattle, Washington for the video games industry, to say, as a matter of public policy, non-disclosures cannot be enforced where they pertain to material misstatements on royalty statements. At the stroke of a pen, you put more money into more artists' hands than like all the copyright reforms the last 40 years.
So presently, I'm an artist. I sign a record deal, or I sign something, and I think you've miscalculated my rate. Part of the recompense that I get is I don't announce this to anybody. I sign an NDA, and I do not bring up the fact that they screwed up.
Or you have to sue.
Okay.
Right.
Whereas you're saying there ought to be an exemption for that. NDAs cannot include when you screw up on royalty payments. That way, it sounds like what you're describing is that the record companies have figured out it's just cheaper for us to pay like a pittance fine than it is to actually adhere to the law. And so we're going to pay the people off for their silence, pay the fine. It's still cheaper than actually doing the royalties. You're saying exempt that from an NDA. That way they're actually held accountable and people know what's going on.
Yeah. But it's not a fine, it's a settlement. So they're paying 50 cents on the dollar. And then what they're doing is they're making sure that the person who knows exactly how they got ripped off doesn't tell anyone else they're ripping off how they're doing it, so that they don't show up at their door and say, hey, you screwed that guy using this accounting trick. Did you screw me using that accounting trick? Right? Because that's where it all unravels. So if you catch them, they bind you over to silence. We had one source that had a 6-figure accounting error in the label's favor, and they had to yield 50% of it because their lawyer said it was going to cost more than half of that to sue to get the other half. So the way to come out ahead was to do this. So, with Sarbanes-Oxley, we had the institution of individual criminal liability for executives that signed off on misleading financial statements. It made a huge difference. Like in the record industry, it had been common practice to run a third shift at CD pressing plants that was off the books. So a third of the CDs pressed would just not be accounted for on royalty statements. And that ended the day they signed Sarbanes-Oxley, right? So a lot of this stuff can be done by shifting liability around, attributing personal liability, changing contracting regimes in a relatively small number of places. I mean, again, like this is about getting a law through Congress is very hard, as we all know, but changing contracting terms in 3 states or just one state, like one state would make a huge difference. It was just California or just New York or just, you could liberate every country and Western musician just by changing the law in Tennessee, right? Every country and Western musician in the world suddenly is making more money if you could just change the law in Tennessee. So these are like very highly leveraged policy interventions. And so we have about a half dozen of them in the book. That's one of my favorites. We always tell people when they read the book, as they read the first 6 chapters where we lay out how the scams work, that don't be alarmed by that high-pitched ringing of your incipient aneurysm. Read the second half of the book because it's going to explain what to do.
Great. Well, on that note, I think I told you, Cory, that this is going to be 40 minutes. We've hit an hour, and I know you're very busy, so I want to be respectful of your time. How about this? I'm enjoying the novel. Can you give a pitch on the novel? And then when the dust settles, I would love to have you back on, and I'll read your other book. We could have more in-depth conversation, but I'll give you some time to recoup from your current travails.
Yeah. I mean, I write a lot of books. I write when I'm anxious, so I wrote 9 books during lockdown. And I've written 3 or 4 since, so they pile up. But that was one of them. So one of the books I wrote in my hammock was a book called Red Team Blues, and it had a very odd conceit. It was, what if I wrote the final volume of a beloved long-running series without writing the rest of the series? Like that kind of vibe you get by like reading the thrilling conclusion of something you've been tuned into for a long time, that last episode of MASH vibe. And it worked so well that my editor bought 3 more. or two more rather, three in total. The next day, I emailed it to him, and in the morning he'd bought three of them. And I moped for a bit because the book is about a 67-year-old forensic accountant who's been in Silicon Valley for 40 years, unwinding every weird finance tech bro scam that anyone's ever come up with. Uh, and he really earns his retirement, right? By the end of this one last job book, I just didn't have the heart to put him back in harness. But I realized if I wrote them out of order, that I could not only like fulfill my contractual obligations, but also like I get this incredible plot advantage, which is that there's no continuity problems when you're writing out of order, because any apparent contradiction can be resolved by interposing another story in between the two apparently contradictory ones, and it all works. So in this book, the third book, Picks and Shovels, Marty Hench goes back to his first adventure. He starts as a typical MIT screw up. He's so busy programming computers that he fails out of the computer science program. And he goes off to be a CPA, not because he's all that interested in accounting, but because he's really interested in the lab full of Apple II Pluses they've just bought. And those are like outside of his price range, and he wants to get his hands on them. And the next thing you know, he's following his genius coder roommate out to Silicon Valley. And at this moment, the PC revolution is kicking off. And this was the moment of weird PCs. Like, we forget now that PCs have kind of converged on a single form factor and use case, that when they started, no one knew who was supposed to make PCs, who was supposed to use them, what they were supposed to use them for. And there were companies that just made crazy, interesting, kind of evolutionary dead end PCs. I grew up in Ontario, like all best Americans. I'm a Canadian. And the Ontario Ministry of Education made a computer called the Sammy Icon that booted 3 different operating systems, including a logo prompt. And it came in this huge piece of injection molded plastic with a cassette drive and a giant trackball, like on an arcade centipede game. So Marty ends up working for a weird PC company called Fidelity Computing, and it sounds like the setup for a joke. It's run by a Mormon bishop, a Catholic priest, and an Orthodox rabbi. But the joke is that it's pyramid selling. They are doing the classic pyramid sellers move of preying on faith groups. And they sell these faith groups through this pyramid model, PCs that are designed to lock them in and pick their pockets for as long as they're locked in. So not only can the data not be moved off of this computer, you can't even use a regular floppy disk in the floppy drive. You have to buy very expensive floppy disks. They've re-sprocketed the fanfold printers with slightly wider sprockets so that you can't use regular fanfold paper in them. You have to buy their 5X paper. And Marty realizes he's working for the bad guys when he goes to work for them, when he sees who their competition are. It's 3 women who've quit the firm, ex-sales managers, and repented their sins and made it their mission in life to set free all of the parishioners they sold these bad PCs to by making interoperable computers, floppy disks that work in any floppy drive as well as theirs, or floppy drives that can read any floppy disks, or adapters so you can use their printers with your own computer, or you can use your own computer with their printers, and so on and so on. Anything to set people free. And these 3 women, one is a gay Orthodox woman whose family has kicked her out because she's come out, and one is a Mormon woman who's left her faith over opposition to the Equal Rights Amendment. One is a nun who's left her order because she's gotten involved with the liberation theology movement and opposing the dirty wars in Central America. And he goes to work for them. And he learns that the kind of operators who aren't above stealing from their parishioners to make millions of dollars are also not above spectacular acts of violence to keep the scam going. And that's when the commercial war becomes a shooting war and the stakes get really high.
This sounds great. Cory, this dovetails incredibly well with the conversation we just had.
Indeed.
I will add, listeners, having now completed the interview with Cory, with no direct incentive on my end other than enjoyment, I will continue reading the book because it's a good book, and I encourage you to do it. If you're enchanted with Cory, you're intrigued by him, or alternately you just like good novels. This is the Andrew Heaton seal of approval. It's a good novel. I think you will enjoy it, and I have greatly enjoyed talking to you, Cory. Talking to you is like drinking out of a fire hose. I'm gonna have to get some like illicit, illegal nootropics or something the next time I speak to you. But it was a pleasure talking to you now.
Oh, well, thank you. It's my treat as well.
All right, let me ask you something. Did you have fun and/or learn something today? Here's a fun fact about William Thornton, first superintendent of the Patent Office. I am not making this up. Thornton was, as I mentioned, a doctor, and he was summoned to Mount Vernon to treat George Washington on his deathbed in 1799. By the time Thornton arrived, Washington had expired and his body was in the family crypt frozen. So Thornton tried to convince Martha to let him bring George's corpse back to life. His proposal was to thaw out the corpse in cold water, lay George on some blankets, warm up the body while pumping air into his lungs, and give him a blood transfusion from a lamb. He was pretty confident that, using science, he could bring Washington back to life. George Frankenstein Washington. But the family wouldn't let him. They wouldn't let him try to bring Washington back to life, despite what an amazing premise to a fun novel that is of zombie Washington. Now tell me, with a straight face, look me in the eyes, tell me, you're not going to at some point bring up William Thornton arguing with the British Army or trying to revive Washington's frozen corpse. This is never going to come up. Tell me you're not going to mention to your spouse tonight that the first superintendent of the Patent Office tried to bring George Washington's frozen corpse back from the dead. Or that Cory wasn't an interesting and knowledgeable guest. Come on, this was a good episode. It's a good show. If you get something out of The Political Orphanage, please support it. Go to thepoliticalorphanage.com. You'll make the show possible, and you'll get bonus content. The bonus content is my personal property, and I own it. And I only grant access to people who like the show enough to make it possible. So step up, become a senior orphan. Although, to tip the deck a little bit, wait until next week, because some stuff's about to happen. So, I don't know, just here's what I want you to do. Just remember this moment that we had where you're like, yeah, Heaton's pretty good, I give him money. Don't do it right now. Wait until next week, okay? But I'm building up social capital in your mind, all right? I'm even being honest with you about it. So, there's that. All right, let's get out of here. That's the show. Thanks for listening. Thank you, Cory Doctorow, for coming on. Thank you, Jim Swift, who let me borrow his copy of A History of the Early Patent Office in the year 2010, in which I learned about William Thornton and have been saving until now. And thank you, patrons who make the whole program possible. Until next time, I've been Andrew Heaton, and so have you.